What does it take for a police officer to get fired? Regina Tasca, a 20-year veteran officer from Bogota, New Jersey, was terminated by the town council on September 20th. This decision came after a lengthy investigation into her purported misdeeds. Prior to her termination, Officer Tasca had never been reprimanded for misconduct. She had not generated any citizen complaints and was being considered for promotion before she got into trouble in April 2011. What horrible thing did Officer Tasca do that led to her being purged from the police force? Before answering that question, it's worth reviewing a few recent cases of severe police misconduct in order to establish a baseline of common disciplinary standards. 4 officers in the Houston Police Department were recently suspended for engaging in a scheme to embezzle overtime pay by falsifying traffic tickets. Since 2008, the officers had fraudulently collected more than $1 million in overtime. One of them, Senior Officer Matthew Davis, soaked up $347,000 in 2008 alone. Davis had previously been suspended for improperly dismissing tickets at the request of a city council member. Davis received a 30-day unpaid suspension, as did fellow officer Steve Running. Senior Officer Kenneth Bigger was handed a 20-day suspension. The sternest punishment, if the term could be applied here, was imposed on Sergeant Paul Terry, who was suspended for 45 days. By any rational standard, embezzling $1 million is a serious crime. None of these officers face criminal charges. None of them has been required to make restitution. None of them was fired. Thus, it would be reasonable to expect that Regina Tasca's firing offense would be more serious than defrauding Houston's tax victims out of $1 million. As it happens, her offense had nothing to do with corruption of any kind. On September 22nd, a Houston police officer named Matthew Jacob Martin shot and killed a one-armed, one-legged man in a wheelchair who was armed with a pen. The victim was an emotionally disturbed man living in a rest home. The caretaker made the common and consistently fatal mistake of calling the police in the misguided hope that they could help. According to Houston Police Department spokeswoman Jody Silva, the shooting was justified because Officer Martin feared, quote, for his partner's safety and his own safety, despite the fact that they were both young, able-bodied, armed individuals confronting an invalid in a wheelchair who was armed with a writing utensil. This is not Officer Martin's first fatal shooting. It is obviously an act of criminal homicide. It is just as obvious that Martin will not be prosecuted, nor is it likely that he will suffer injury to his career. It so happens that the incident that led to Regina Tasca's firing offense involved an emotionally disturbed and unarmed individual who was perceived as a threat to officer safety. Did she shoot and kill the subject, or use disproportionate force in subduing him? No. As the officer in charge of the situation, Tasca followed the Bogota Police Department's use of force policy to the letter by intervening to protect the victim from a criminal assault committed by an officer from another department. As Officer Tasca summarized the matter in an interview with Pro Libertate, quote, I didn't fail to aid another officer. I acted to stop a beatdown. In an almost unprecedented act of principle, Tasca intervened to stop Sergeant Joe Rella's assault on 22-year-old Kyle Sharp, an emotionally troubled young man who had done nothing to justify police violence of any kind. About 2 days after the episode, Tasca was labeled a danger to her fellow officers and suspended by the department. Following a year of disciplinary reviews, psychological evaluations, and a spurious legal process worthy of the Soviet Union, Tasca was fired. Tasca was on patrol on April 29, 2011, when she got a call from medical assistance. Former Bogota Council member Tara Sharp, concerned about the erratic behavior of her son Kyle, called the police to take him to the hospital for a psychological evaluation. As noted earlier, requesting police intervention, particularly in cases of this kind, is never a good idea. Sharp was exceptionally fortunate that Officer Tasca was the first to respond. She has years of experience as an EMT and had just completed specialized training on situations involving psychologically disturbed people. Once on the scene, Tasca acted quickly to calm down the distraught young man. When the call came, I heard that a couple of officers from Ridgefield Park were coming to provide backup, which I thought was okay, Tasca related to me. Kyle had been shouting and swearing when I got there, but I got him calmed down. The young man's mood changed abruptly when he saw the other officers arrive. He noticed them and asked me, "Why is there another police officer here from another town?" Then he said that he was leaving, and he moved maybe 2 or 3 steps when one of the Ridgefield officers jumped him. The official report on the matter, which was written by retired Judge Richard Donahue, claims that Kyle, quote, was aggressive and started to walk away. Only someone incurably inhospitable to both logic and honesty would describe walking away as aggressive behavior. Kyle also instructed the police not to step on his property, which was a lawful order the police were required to obey. Instead, Sergeant Chris Tybalt tackled Kyle, wrapped him in a bear hug, and attempted to handcuff him. Within an instant, Sergeant Joe Rella piled on and began to slug Kyle in the head, while his horrified mother screamed at the officers to stop. According to Tybalt, it was necessary to assault Kyle because he believed, quote, danger is near for us if we let this kid go. No, really. That's what Tybalt said under oath. Tasca instinctively did what any legitimate peace officer would do. She intervened to protect the victim, pulling Rella off the helpless and battered young man. In nearly every other case of which we have record, police officers close ranks and protect the assailant from outside intervention once a beating has begun. Tasca's act was one of instinctive decency, genuine principle, and no small amount of courage. It was also the action dictated by her department's use of force policy, the first page of which specifies that it is the responsibility of law enforcement to prevent or stop the illegal or inappropriate use of force by other officers. In his report on the case, Judge Donahue acknowledged that Tasca acted in compliance with the use of force policy, but he dismissed that fact on the preposterous grounds that, quote, no evidence was presented to establish that Officer Tasca even knew about the document. Only an uncommonly inventive sophist would argue that the important question is whether Tasca was aware of the document stating the policy, rather than whether her actions were in accord with that policy. After the Ridgefield officers handcuffed Kyle, who, it should be recalled, was not a criminal suspect, nor the subject of a medical order of any kind, they directed their fury at Tasca. One of them yelled at me, "We can't have this," she recalled. I said, "We can't have what?" There was no reason to take that kid to the ground and start slugging him. This was a medical assistance call, and the mother was sitting there screaming at them to stop beating on their son. Earlier in the same month, Tasca had prompted criticism for failing to rush to the aid of her partner, a male cop who suffered a trivial scratch on his hand during a brief confrontation with a tiny drunken woman at a hospital. At the time, the woman, who posed no conceivable threat to a male cop who towered over her by roughly 10 inches and outweighed her by about 100 pounds, was surrounded by at least a dozen people who could have rendered aid to the poor beleaguered hero in body armor. Yet Tasca's refusal to shove aside med-techs, nurses, and security guards in order to help her traumatized partner ground and pound the tiny woman supposedly demonstrated a pattern of bizarre and outrageous behavior on her part that made her an unacceptable risk to her colleagues. This was the assault that figures so prominently in the charges against Tasca. The officers who ganged up on Kyle Sharp have not been charged or subjected to administrative discipline. As mentioned earlier, Tasca's partner, Officer Jay Fowler, suffered a trivial scratch, yet he spent a week on paid medical leave as a result of the supposed brawl with that tiny intoxicated woman. Nobody had said anything to me about the earlier case until after the incident with the Ridgefield officers, Tasca pointed out to me in an interview. After being put on suspension, Tasca was subjected to a psychological evaluation by Dr. Matthew Geller, a psychiatrist who does contract work for New Jersey law enforcement agencies. Geller provided the diagnosis he had been paid for, ruling that Tasca was unfit for duty. At the same time, the Bogota PD's internal affairs officer produced a report concluding that Tasca's refusal to assist Officer Fowler in the April 3rd incident in the hospital demonstrated her unfitness. The Internal Affairs Review wasn't exactly a model of investigative rigor, Tasca observes. There were nearly a dozen other people who witnessed the incident, and the only one he interviewed was a 14-year-old ambulance corps volunteer who happened to be his niece. Tasca, an openly gay female police officer, believes that at least some of the problems she's experienced are the product of a cultural clash with what she describes as the old boys club. Judge Donahue's report confirmed that Tasca had been treated badly by fellow officers. There was an incident in which her locker was damaged, and 2 other instances in which she was criticized for writing traffic citations against another officer, thereby not extending what is euphemistically called professional courtesy. Despite such frictions, Tasca's job appeared secure until she committed the unpardonable offense of crossing the blue line by taking the side of a mundane being attacked by a member of the Brotherhood. Although she had suffered what appeared to be symptoms of hypertension in the past, Tasca was never given a negative medical or psychological review during her 20 years as a police officer until she crossed the blue line. The evaluation conducted by Michael Geller reads like something compiled by a state-employed psychiatrist in the Brezhnev-era Soviet Union. Geller claims that Tasca suffers from something called a mixed personality disorder, displaying, quote, a personality type characterized by a long-standing pattern of grandiose self-importance and exaggerated sense of talent and achievement. This purported dysfunction, once again, wasn't noticed until after Tasca displayed the character and integrity to take the morally appropriate action, the one dictated by the official guidelines of her department, in defiance of pressure from her peers and superiors to conform. During her 2 decades as a police officer, Tasca has noticed a dramatic change in the institutional culture of law enforcement. I think what we're seeing is a lot of kids who are given power and immediately begin to abuse it, Tasca observed to me. Some of these guys are as young as 18 years old. You give them a uniform and it goes right to their head. And even many of those who don't do abusive things miss the point, which is that we're supposed to be peace officers. They get a badge and a gun and they think they're gods, or at least that they're entitled to treat people like dirt. I see them as people and insist on treating them like I'd want to be treated. In contemporary law enforcement, commitment to the Golden Rule is a firing offense. Just ask Ramon Perez, whose experience is strikingly similar to that of Regina Tasca. Perez, a probationary officer who had won the top leadership award at his police academy, was purged from the Austin, Texas Police Department as a result of his refusal to use a taser on an elderly, nonviolent man during a domestic disturbance in January 2005. The order was unconstitutional, illegal, a violation of the guidelines in the department's handbook, and most importantly, immoral. A few days after that incident, Perez was given a punitive transfer to the night shift. 2 months later, Perez was told to report to Austin PD psychologist Carol Logan to undergo what he was told would be a communication exercise. In fact, it was a disguised fit-for-duty review intended to ratify the preordained decision to fire him. Logan's 4-page report focused entirely on Perez's moral and religious beliefs. Perez is a self-described, non-denominational fundamentalist Christian and ordained minister who homeschools his children. He is also firmly convinced that protection of civil liberties is the paramount duty of a peace officer, a duty he regarded literally as a sacred trust. According to Logan, the depth of his commitment to his beliefs, beginning with that perennially unpopular tenet called the Golden Rule, produces an impairment of his ability to absorb new facts, to communicate with his superiors, and to deal with feedback. As was the case with Regina Tasca, Ramon Perez's detractors dredged up a second incident of misconduct involving a refusal to use unnecessary force. By twice displaying a peace officer's preference for de-escalation, Perez had established himself as a repeat offender. He was purged from the APD, a department that has since done much to distinguish itself in the face of fierce and plentiful competition as one of the most abusive in the country. A vast geographic and cultural gulf separates Ramon Perez, a fundamentalist evangelical from Texas, and Regina Tasca, an openly gay Roman Catholic from New Jersey. They have at least one critically important thing in common. Both of them intervened in defense of helpless citizens facing criminal violence from fellow cops, and learned that for people who have chosen a career in law enforcement, behaving like a peace officer is a firing offense.